Thank you, Dr. Broughton. I don't know about the Superwoman part, though. We are just about 2 weeks away from the 21st anniversary of the first landing on the moon. This was an event of great significance in our history, but not exactly in the way we perceived it at the time. Back then, we saw the moon landing primarily as a symbol of our first step into the universe. Coming as it did at the end of the 1960s, it capped a period of unprecedented technological growth and seemingly validated the technological optimism that characterized the 60s and fed that growth. For most of human history, going to the moon epitomized the impossible. How many times had someone said, "I can no more do that than I could fly to the moon"? Then suddenly, there we were, leaving boot prints in the fine gray dust on the lunar surface. Those footprints became an icon of our technological success. But those missions to the moon also gave us another image, one whose legacy is only now coming to fruition. I refer, of course, to the image of Earth rising above the lunar surface. In fact, we saw that image for the first time 6 months before the first landing mission, when the crew of Apollo 8 orbited the moon at Christmas time in 1968. They were the first human beings to venture beyond the protective embrace of Earth orbit, and therefore the first to gain a vantage point in space from which we could view our planet as a whole. I was looking over the audience earlier today to do a rough count of how many people remember those times. I often speak to groups of quite young students, most of whom were not alive at the time of the Apollo 8 and Apollo 11 missions. For those youngsters who are too young to remember a time when we had never seen the Earth this way, it is often hard for them to fully appreciate just what a tremendous psychological impact the image had. But it profoundly changed the way we view our home planet, and it taught us a few important truths. The first was that the Earth is indeed a planet. We knew this before Apollo 8, of course, but we had never seen it. Seeing it gave us a new sense of scale. In fact, it taught us a second important truth, that Earth is actually rather a small place, and that it has boundaries and limits. This has been a hard lesson for us to learn. In fact, I'm not sure we've learned it yet. Because for most of human history, we have been earthbound, and from that vantage point, the planet, with its vast oceans, atmosphere, and land masses, and its great diversity and abundance of life, has seemed huge, unassailable, inexhaustible. Indeed, for most of the millions of years that humans have been on Earth, our energies have been consumed with meeting the environmental challenges this planet throws at us and wresting survival from it. It is thus a great psychological leap for us to accept the reality we now see from space, that of a small, finite Earth. The third lesson we've learned is that Earth is alone, that it is an isolated haven for life in a black and mostly empty space. Nothing makes this more palpable than seeing that image of a blue-white planet suspended against the stark blackness of space or rising above the bleak dead surface of the moon, seeing how thin that membrane of the atmosphere is. Indeed, the utter deadness of the moon is highlighted, ironically, by the fact that the footprints we left there are untouched, unchanged, as they would be on Earth, by winds or rivers or rain, or by the footprints of other living things. We've looked for life in our solar system and so far found nothing, not even microbes. And while we may someday find something, somewhere, we know now that we won't find the dazzling diversity of life found on Earth anywhere nearby. For now, and for the foreseeable future, Earth is all we've got. Going into space has also taught us that Earth is not just a home, but a life support system. Indeed, it has forced upon us a keen awareness of just how much we take for granted all that Earth provides, because staying alive out there has proved to be one of the most challenging things we've ever attempted. The space environment could hardly be more hostile to human survival. It is characterized by extremes of heat and cold, an almost total vacuum, high levels of radiation, and uniquely among the frontiers we have encountered in the past, it lacks even the most basic resources of food, water, and air. So we take our life support system with us. We build marvelously intricate spacecraft to provide the resources we need, and to do more than that. Because these resources are so difficult and expensive to lift out of the deep well of Earth's gravity, because they are therefore always in limited supply, we design our technological life support systems with great care. The Space Shuttle, for example, has 4 major life support components: the pressurization system, the air revitalization system, the active thermal control system, the water and waste management system. These systems work together to provide the crew with breathable air while keeping toxic gases below dangerous levels. It controls temperature and humidity. It provides clean water for drinking and personal hygiene. And it controls waste products in a safe and sanitary way. So there we have it. In space, we make sure the air and water are clean. We manage wastes and control contaminants to ensure they do not foul the life support system. We control temperature swings to make sure they do not become too extreme. We prevent a buildup of carbon dioxide. We conserve and recycle resources because we are all too aware of their scarcity and our vulnerability if they run out. I remember vividly how our attention was riveted by the dilemma of the Apollo 13 astronauts as they struggled to come home after an explosion crippled their spacecraft nearly 250,000 miles away. It was a story about life support, how the crew was forced to abandon their command module and rely on the resources of the lunar module, which became their lifeboat for 3 long days. For 3 long days, we learned the intricacies of lithium hydroxide canisters. Most of us had never heard of it before, and probably most of us have never heard of it since. But these were the things that scrubbed the carbon dioxide, the excess carbon dioxide from the cabin atmosphere, and were one of the many components that were absolutely critical for that crew to survive and make it home. And when their parachutes opened over the Pacific Ocean, and interestingly enough, dropped them absolutely right on target, we saw the mission as a triumph and not a failure. So we know what it takes to stay alive in space. In fact, we spend billions of dollars to ensure the survival of a handful of people for a few days or weeks or months at a time when we're out there. The real puzzle is why we aren't exercising equal prudence in the management of the life support system on which all 5.2 billion of us and millions of other species depend. Well, you can see the paradox. Far from scrubbing the air of excess carbon dioxide, as they do on the shuttle, we're pumping CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at an accelerating and now worrying rate. This will ultimately lead to climate warming. Some scientists are of the opinion this has already started, although this is controversial. And the consequences are to some extent unpredictable, but potentially quite catastrophic. Flooding in some areas, drought in others, rising sea levels, dropping lake levels, more severe storms, larger and more rapid swings in temperature. In other words, more rude surprises. And although it is impossible to prove that the current dramatic events that have occurred over the last couple of years with the weather have actually been caused by the climate warming resulting from the CO2 from human activities, I think that these events have given us a taste of what the future might be like. And there's more. The ozone layer that protects us from the sun's biologically damaging ultraviolet radiation is being eroded by long-lived industrial chemicals. Most of these chemicals are already in the lower atmosphere. They have not even begun to reach the upper atmosphere, so even if we stop their use tomorrow, the destruction of ozone would likely continue for a century or more. Over the Antarctic and the Arctic, large ozone holes have begun to appear at certain times of the year, a phenomenon so startling and unexpected that the first evidence of its existence, which was detected by satellites, was disregarded by scientists. In fact, when the data came in, The satellites were basically told to ignore it because such a large deviation from the expected couldn't possibly be real. That's why it took them 3 years to find out that it was a real phenomenon. All over the world, forests are being burned or chopped down or decimated by acid rain, contributing to massive soil erosion and flooding in some regions and to the spreading of deserts in others. Because trees are an important repository of carbon, deforestation also plays a key role in altering the Earth's climate. I found a certain grim irony when I was reading recently a NASA design study that suggested plants should be an important component of the life support system of future space colonies because of their ability to regenerate oxygen and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So again, we go out there at great expense and difficulty, and we want to take plants out there for what they can do for the atmosphere, and also because we want to share an otherwise sterile technological environment with other living things. Again, you can see the paradox. Deforestation is also steadily destroying the biological and genetic diversity of life on Earth. Forests, especially those in the tropics, shelter millions of species. Most of them we haven't even identified, and millions are being killed off before we can catalog their existence. In fact, this has been described by one scientist as the equivalent of burning all of the libraries on Earth without bothering to see what's in them. Now, species have come and gone in the past, of course. As one researcher put it, extinction is a way of life. But scientists believe that the rate of extinction over the next few decades may go as high as 1,000 times the normal rate, largely because of human activities. The Earth's carrying capacity, its very nature as a life support system, is, it appears, very much threatened. And there's still more. Toxic chemicals are seeping into the ground. Raw sewage is flowing into rivers and oceans. Corpses of beluga whales found on the shores of the St. Lawrence are so contaminated that they must be handled as toxic waste. When I see pictures of AIDS-contaminated blood vials and used hypodermic needles washing up on the beaches, I feel as though the Earth must, in its own way, be echoing that famous line from the movie Network: "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." I'm also reminded of the famous understatement of Apollo 13 Commander James Lovell when he realized that the loud bang he'd heard from the back of his spacecraft not only spelled the end of the mission, but put the lives of the crew in serious jeopardy. "Houston, we've got a problem here," he said. Many scientists are now saying essentially the same thing about the Earth. Those who attended an international climate conference in Toronto in 1988 put it this way: humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to nuclear war. Unfortunately, unlike the Apollo 13 astronauts, we don't have a lifeboat to crawl into, nor do we have lithium hydroxide canisters to scrub the atmosphere of excess carbon dioxide. And finally, that brings me to the matter of our numbers. There were rather at the beginning of this year, about 5.2 billion people on Earth, and an estimated 90 to 100 million will be added before the end of this year. The population is now doubling about every 40 to 50 years, the fastest in human history. At a UNESCO conference in Vancouver, scientists said that, and I quote, "In an unbelievably short span of time, unplanned and almost mindlessly, our species has become by far the largest factor for change on the planet. Survival of the planet has become of central and immediate concern," unquote. I ask you, is this any way to run a planetary life support system? Clearly not. And we know better. So why are we doing it? Partly, I think, because until quite recently, we didn't really realize what we were doing. In fact, we still don't fully understand the dimensions of the problem, nor can we be certain of the consequences of our actions. I think that the space program has helped us to come to some understanding of the dimensions of the problem in many important ways. Remote sensing from Earth orbit, even being able to see the planet with our own eyes, has not only created an awareness of what's happening, the fact that we can, for example, see cities on the surface of the Earth from space. We can see the indications of our technological development. On the night side, the planet is ablaze with lights, testament to our use of energy and the extent to which we have encroached upon the natural environment. But there's another reason for our behavior, I believe, and that stems from our past perceptions of Earth as being too huge, too resilient, too durable for human activities to do much real and lasting damages. And again, images from space have disabused us of that misguided notion. They have documented all too plainly how the Earth's environment is changing and the impact that human activities have had. From the ozone holes to the spreading desert, from the brown silted rivers disgorging the topsoil into the oceans to the clear-cut forests. Images like this can take much of the credit for the current high level of environmental concern and awareness, and for forcing us to face up to what we've been doing. And they offer important tools for us to use in our attempts to solve the problem. However, the images from space may well have a paradoxical effect on the space program itself, particularly the manned program. As our environmental problems on Earth worsen, and that does seem inevitable, the never-ending debate about the worthiness of the space program seems bound to intensify. We are talking now about returning to the moon and even venturing onward to Mars. But I wonder if the political and public support will be there over the next decade or two if, as some environmentalists believe, we find ourselves beset by environmental catastrophes, chaotic and extreme climatic conditions, disappearing forests, a disintegrating ozone layer, and all the social and economic disruption that they will entail. If one thinks of those first pictures from the moon in July of 1969 as being the birth of our environmental consciousness, that makes us 21 years old at the moment, environmentally speaking. And it's interesting, I think, to think of it in terms of a human lifetime. That would have made the 70s our childhood. And if one thinks back, that was a time of, again, tremendous optimism, looking to the future, technological growth. And we did have a lot of technological toys in the 1970s. If we look at the 80s as our adolescence, we see it as an acquisitive and self-centered adolescence, an overriding concern with getting and buying, consuming and throwing away. So what of the 90s as we become a young adult, environmentally speaking? Perhaps it's time to grow up. Personally, I'd hope that the next century would find us fighting for survival in space, not down here. I've personally always believed that we belong out there. It suits our nature, for we are a species that has always wanted to know what lies over the horizon, a species that needs to explore and face great challenges, a species that needs to push itself to the limits. I've always believed that the challenge of going into space, of learning how to live and work out there, speaks to some of the best and most human things in us, and therefore it's worth doing. But we have a major challenge right here at home now, and it seems to demand as much commitment and skill as it took for us to get to the moon the first time. I have heard it suggested that one rationale for the space program is to ensure the long-term survival of the species, and by that it was meant really long-term, after the sun has died and the Earth has been incinerated. Maybe so, although I suppose it is legitimate to speculate whether we deserve to be set loose in the universe if we can't take proper care of one little planet. But the question of whether we'll get through the next century is more germane at the moment. It's my personal feeling, and I say this actually with great regret because I would have very much loved to have seen a very rapid expansion of humanity's move into first low Earth orbit on a permanent basis and then beyond that to the moon and Mars. But I have reluctantly come to the conclusion that the first question that we face now is not whether we have a future in space, but whether we have a future on Earth. I'm sorry to, that was the ending. I'm sorry to end on such a depressing note. There are some signs of optimism. We just saw yesterday that the nations of the world not only have agreed to completely eliminate the CFCs that are destroying the ozone layer, but finally there is some compromise between the developed world and the developing world on helping the development in the third world at the expense or with the support of the developed world, so that we can tackle this very urgent problem. And as I said, I think that one of the major contributions that the space program has made is this understanding of the Earth as a planet, as a closed life support system. And you can't tackle a problem until you acknowledge that it exists. And I think we have much to thank the Apollo program and everything that has come since then for that awareness and that realization. And perhaps now that we are 21 years old, we will start to behave like adults in a more responsible way with a view to the future of not only of this planet, but perhaps the future of our species out in space. Thank you very much. And I don't know if I'm supposed to take questions now, but I'd be glad to if that's the idea.
I couldn't help thinking maybe we should be selling canisters of lithium hydroxide instead of books. Anyway, if you have any questions at the moment for Ms. Dotto, I'm sure she'd be glad to answer them. And following that, there will be plenty of opportunity in the foyer. Are there any questions right now?
Yes.
Yeah, I had both a question and a comment of my own. I'm afraid I disagree with you on the point of choosing space or the environment, because in my opinion, space is perhaps one of the most integral parts in the environmental effort. Specifically, I know some people here probably heard my show on saving the home planet, the space mission's most crucial mission. Because as I'm sure you're aware, the mission to planet Earth, for example, is a space mission, yes, which is environmentally oriented.
I'm sorry, you may have got the wrong impression. I don't think it's an either-or choice, and I absolutely agree with everything you've said. I think that the vantage point of space is absolutely crucial to our understanding of the home planet. And I wasn't suggesting that we shouldn't be going into space. What I'm concerned about is that I feel that the public and political support for it may become overwhelmed by the panic, if you will, that will occur if these environmental problems start to overwhelm people.
The thing I'm thinking is that surely then part of the job of journalists and people involved with disseminating information on space should be to show the public the importance of the space program in saving the home planet. For example, the greenhouse effect, as you know, on a planetary scale was discovered through investigations at Venus. They weren't discovered on Earth. And maybe that's the point we should be making with the public more, that this is a part of the effort.
I think that point has been often made by science journalists. Well, I think you have to, for one thing, you can't sort of lump all the media into one group, because we have comparatively few full-time science writers in the media. Many of the people who are writing about these issues are not science writers. And you also have to, I think you do run into a philosophical difference of opinion, and I'm sure that I don't need to tell any of you here, because this debate has been raging since the beginning of the space program, and it probably will continue to rage. To some extent, the attitude that it is worth our going out there, that there are not only tangible and direct economic returns, but also intangible ones and important sort of long-term philosophical ones, in my view, tends to be somewhat a matter of faith. And it's very difficult sometimes to convince people who don't see the space program that way. You can give them all the facts and figures. You can demonstrate to them that we're not spending so much money in space, that we're not dealing with social problems, et cetera, and they remain unconvinced.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, Carl Sagan recently pointed out in the Planetary Report that the whole point of using the space program and exploring the planets to help on the Earth is a point NASA should make more. So perhaps there's where part of the problem lies. If the point isn't being made, if the selling point isn't being made, then not surprisingly, people don't know.
I certainly think that there could be a great deal more emphasis placed on that. But I think that some of the proponents of that might find themselves, even if that were to happen, I think they might find themselves a little bit disappointed by the fact that this would, I don't think it would sway as many people as they hope it would. Because I do think that it is a matter of philosophical and almost a matter of faith, which way you look at it.
Right.
And, you know, personally, I'm on the side of going out there because, not only because of the benefits that it returns to us, but because I think from the point of view of who we are, the nature of who we are, it's very important for us to do that. We don't give up on challenges, and I don't think we've given up on the Earth yet either. So I think it's important to do that, but there's a lot of people who don't think that way.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, John.
Just a brief comment on that previous issue. And my feeling is that the whole argument about the space program budget is a bit misguided. The space program budget is a fraction of the cost of the arms race, and really that's where you should be putting your attention on. Is it worth spending money on this?
Again, I have no disagreement with that whatsoever. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave the impression that I thought we should abandon space. By no means, absolutely not. All I was suggesting was that this debate that the space program perpetually finds itself in is likely to become even more enjoined in the future because of what's happening on Earth. And I absolutely agree that if one is looking for culprits in terms of the money that's needed to support environmental activities and social programs, that indeed this ought to be coming from the $1 trillion plus a year that we're spending on the arms race.
I just thought I'd like to put in a little bit of pessimism. In my long life of dealing with people, I have found that the public is uneducatable. And
Oh. You mean I should just give up and go home, eh?
No, but I think that most of the lay public get educated through advertisements and not through formal education or intended education from places like NASA and so on. And I'm just wondering if we couldn't farm it out to some of these advertising agencies to help us with our education.
If the military will give you their $1 trillion budget, you could probably do that. Actually, it is interesting. There was a study that was done. I've been very involved with the whole area of public awareness of science. I'm a member of the advisory committee for the Royal Society of Canada on public awareness of science, and also in science literacy. And Edna Einsiedel, who is at the University of Calgary, recently released a report which was a sort of survey of the Canadian public and their levels of scientific literacy. And she asked questions that were very similar to questions that were asked in the United States and Britain in similar surveys. And it's a little discouraging when you find that something like a quarter of the population does not know that light travels faster than sound, and a fifth of the population does not know that the Earth goes around the sun, as opposed to vice versa. So that's kind of the level that you're dealing with. Now, the other point I'd like to mention is that a lot, whether scientists like it or not, and mostly they don't, a lot of people get a fair bit of what they know about science from the media, and not from formal education or from scientific, and certainly not from scientific papers and that sort of thing. And I think that the state of science writing in this country actually has been declining, generally speaking, and certainly in terms of quantity to some extent, and I think to some extent also in terms of quality. And the major problem here is that the control of the media, the people who make the decisions about what resources will be devoted to science writing, how much money will be spent, where it will be played, etc., are people whose last close encounter with science was what they were force-fed in high school. And there's, I think, a very negative attitude towards science on the part of the media managers, and this is a real stumbling block in terms of getting better quality science and having science writers who are knowledgeable, who have the time and the resources to do their homework and to develop expertise in the field. It's extremely difficult to do that in the media.
You don't have any brilliant suggestions? Because I was just thinking,
no, well,
the ideas that people have are mostly from the very brilliant ads that are on the TV. Everybody worries about cholesterol because it causes heart attacks, but they don't think it has that heart attacks from anything else.
Well,
And,
there's no
it-
question that advertising is a very powerful force. When I do a lot of speaking to scientific groups about how the media operate, and they're always a little distressed when I point out to them that they have a misperception that the function of the media is to provide information to the public, when in fact increasingly the function of the media is to deliver consumers to advertisers.
Mhm.
And in fact, it has been explicitly stated in these terms by people who run the media. So perhaps you're right, maybe advertising is the way to go. But I don't have any magic solution. I've been trying for 20 years. I'm singing the same song 20 years ago as I am now.
I just want to go back to the point you made about whether we deserve to be able to go out into space if we can't take care of our own planet. I've talked to some people about the space program. I'm very enthusiastic about it myself, but they made a point which I found very difficult to deal with, and that is, are we really taking care when we go out into space to protect that environment too? And there are certainly some very bad examples of how the space program has already started to pollute the low Earth orbit and possibly even the moon by putting our own waste products there. So I think if we are going to go out into space, we have to take care that we don't think of it as an infinite garbage dump, the way we've often felt about our earthly frontiers.
That's right. I think, though, that you're right, absolutely. Low Earth orbit is becoming quite a hazardous area now, and NASA's severely concerned not only for the safety of things like the shuttle, but also the potential damage to the space station and to things like the telescope and whatnot. So, but I think that, you know, again, it goes back to this question of scale. Our brains have a hard time assimilating anything as large as this planet, much less space, and so we do tend to think of it as an infinite garbage dump. And it's been a terribly difficult thing psychologically for us. It's taken us 20 years from when we saw those pictures for that finally to sink in. And I think that it relates to, I heard one scientist suggest one time that the human brain is really, because biology does not evolve as fast as technology. And the brain that we have is basically the same model that was issued in our hunter-gatherer days. And it is designed for survival in that kind of an environment, which it tends to be preoccupied with short-term survival, because, you know, if you don't take care of the immediate requirements for food and getting away from the tiger, then tomorrow doesn't matter. And some people have suggested that our brains are kind of still in that mode, and we have a great deal of difficulty coming to terms with these infinite spaces and longer time frames. I don't know biologically whether that's true, but it seems to ring to me a kind of a true chord in our reactions to things.
The speaker here, and then Dr. Rissi.
Just a comment on a side problem of the education issue is that there's, I think, a part of the human condition as well, at least in large populations, is the wish to cover one's eyes to problems. I've seen some reaction to David Suzuki's writings across the Canadian papers, is that we don't want to hear any more of this. It's really depressing. You know, just let's cover away from this and go,
yes,
and that's a problem.
I think psychologically, again, that is a very common reaction. It's a sort of disaster overload. And I think that's coupled in the case of the global environment with a sense of that there's nothing you personally can do to really change it or control it. Interestingly enough, there's been a kind of, to me, a move counter to that by the fact that so many people have taken up things like, you know, refusing plastic bags at the grocery store or recycling things in their blue boxes. And one doesn't want to criticize these efforts because I think they're extremely well meant, and it's a way of trying to bring the problem down to a level that you can do something about yourself. But the problem is that it's really a psychological palliative. It doesn't really solve the problem, and what we really have to address is one of my favorite quotes, and I'm sorry to be so depressing on a Saturday morning, but one of my favorite quotes is, pointing to all the efforts you've made to solve the problem doesn't mean you've solved the problem. And so what we really have to face is, do we want to solve the problem or do we want an A for effort? And I think that's what we're into right now, is we're trying to say, well, you know, we want the A for effort, but I don't really think we're tackling the problem. And I think that the denial part of it and the lack of a sense of personal control is, again, on a psychological level, very difficult for us to come to terms with.
You've given a very eloquent plea in favor of protecting our spacecraft here. You've touched on questions which are unfortunately highly technical and scientific, and it's very difficult for the general public, I think, to understand exactly what the issues are. For instance, I think that the audience should be aware that the questions like global change, the greenhouse effect, is still hotly debated in the scientific community. There is very solid evidence that the CO2 level is increasing, but there is no evidence whatsoever, and not even satisfactory theoretical prediction, that this CO2 increase will change the temperature of the Earth, or in which way it will go. It could go up or down, as you know very well. For in the case of the ozone layers, the CFCs are blamed, and we know that CFCs can deplete ozones. But we also know that quite natural circulation phenomena in the upper atmosphere have been responsible for depletion of ozones in the Antarctic forever, since the Earth exists. So, I mean, it's
well, we
not,
don't know that because we haven't made observations since the Earth exists.
For as long as we've made observations. So my point is that, of course, we must protect the environment. I mean, sewage treatment is important. But these global issues are very complex, and audiences should be informed of all the facets of the debate.
Well, I agree with that. I'm not suggesting for a moment that, and I did point out in my talk that there are a great number of uncertainties. But I think also you have to keep in mind not only the scientific complexities of the issues, but also the nature of the communication from the scientific community to the public. The public has a great deal of difficulty. There's a tremendous mismatch between the way scientists perceive what they do and the way the public and the media perceive what scientists do. The public and the media see science as a process of finding the right answers, and that the job of the scientist is to find the right answers, whereas scientists tend to see themselves as people whose job it is to reduce uncertainty. But it's very difficult for the political system and the media and the public to understand and cope with scientific uncertainty. We are also faced with a situation where when you get this business about the tremendous time lag involved in between the time you actually can perceive, detect, and measure that something has happened, and then you have that tremendous time afterwards where the problem will continue to get worse until it gets better. We are faced with the political problem of being forced to act before we have the ultimate certainty in knowing what is going to happen. So scientists tend to look at it as a scientific problem. But the rest of us, and I think even scientists when they're wearing their hats as normal citizens, have got to face, what do? We have a situation that we have to deal with. And even not dealing with it is a choice. And that's the great difficulty. The other problem that you get into is you mentioned that the CO2 warming hasn't been proved. I agree with that 100%. But we do have notable experts saying that they are now convinced, and they're expressing an opinion based on the best evidence that they have before them. They're convinced that it has either begun to happen or that it inevitably will happen soon, and that regardless of what specifically will happen, say in terms of climate warming, what that will do to the weather, that it is not what is going to happen, how cold it's going to be, how hot it's going to be, how wet or how dry, but how fast the changes are going to occur. The pace of change, regardless of the direction, is something that we're not equipped to cope with. And so one of the problems that you get is you get this scientific debate. When the public sees scientists disagreeing, they think if scientists disagree about a problem, there is no problem. And so that is another difficulty that you have to overcome. There was
Okay, fine.
That's an interesting comment about what I was just going to ask, and that is I've heard it said there's a cultural difference. We are living in a world in the Western society where there are two non-intersecting cultures, and those aren't split on language, those are split on science and non-science. The entire educational system is designed to keep those cultures separate, and we have a scientific culture that debates and has interacted in letters and meanings that the common people do not know. What is a CF, etc.? except some of them fly sometimes. And the communication is the problem between the scientific culture and the non-scientific culture, and there happens to be significantly more non-scientific cultural people in our society. Those are the voters, and those are the people that the politicians will get re-elected by. The politicians are those who are going to expend the money in the directions of encouraging space, which we would like to see encouraged. That particular communication gap is our problem.
Yes.
How do we reach to that person, that extra, the vast majority, and how do we bridge that particular gap? The military problem isn't the problem in this country.
Yeah.
And we're not spending the American dollars, which we seem to always like to have been spent on our behalf. The dollars that we're spending is on welfare. And those welfare dollars are to fund the people that are in the non-scientific culture. That gap is our problem in this culture. And we have to bridge that particular gap.
That's right, actually. It's interesting because when I get into discussions about the space program and somebody comes up to me and says, well, you know, if we had all the money that they spend on space for social programs, you know, we wouldn't have any social problems. And I say to them, look, I'll make you a straight trade. I will give you the entire space budget if you will give me the entire budget for the social programs of this country. And of course, they don't realize that we're talking about, I think it's around 50 million a year, so average at the moment. And I think it was, the last time I looked, it was something like 40-50 billion on social programs. And people are absolutely astounded when you say this. Now, on the business about the gap, I agree with you. There is a tremendous gap, and as a science writer, I kind of feel like I'm, you know, strung out over the middle of this chasm. That really is the function of the professional science communicator, and I guess the good news is that this is now being recognized as a very important skill in itself that is separate from the doing of science, but vital to the doing of science. And as I mentioned, the Royal Society of Canada, over the last 2 years, it has had this advisory committee on public awareness of science. We've held 2 major meetings in Ottawa for the scientific societies, dealing with the whole issue of science communication and better communication, both being done by scientists themselves and encouraging the relationship between scientists and professional science communicators. And you'd be surprised, actually, by a number of initiatives and activities that are going on. There's a program called Science Culture Canada, which is a granting program focusing it runs on the same sort of peer review principle as the other granting agencies, and its purpose is to provide funding for science communication projects across Canada. That's been going for about 6 years. I'm just currently discussing with Mark Garneau Collegiate Institute the possibility, in fact, we are going to be starting a pilot project there for the high school students on science communication. And this will bring together both the students in English and the students in science and teach them communication skills, because this has been identified as an extremely important skill. I would also commend to the universities that they ought to start taking much more seriously teaching communication skills per se to their science students. I don't feel that this is something that they tend to assume that as long as you can write a scientific paper that your communication skills that's all you need for a scientific career. These days, scientists increasingly are called upon to speak to the public, to the press, to politicians. A lot of them can't communicate with anybody other than the 6 other people in the world who are doing the work in their field. They absolutely are totally unprepared to meet a reporter. I give workshops, writing workshops to scientists now, where I turn them into reporters. I give them a scientific paper, usually a fairly obscure, opaque one that they are outside of their field so they can't understand it. They listen to 10 minutes of a taped interview with the principal investigator, and then I give them half an hour to write the first 4 paragraphs of a news story. Well, you wouldn't believe the moaning and groaning and the complaining. And one scientist said to me when we did this, she took all of this material, and I said, all right, you've got half an hour, write 4 paragraphs. She looked at me and she said, do people really write stories with so little information in so little time? And I said, look, you've got it easy. If I were covering a scientific meeting, I might have to do 3 or 4 stories in an afternoon, never mind 4 paragraphs of one story. So she said, well, I don't agree with the premise. And I said, well, most reporters don't either, but unfortunately, if they want a paycheck, they've got to turn in the story to the editor that afternoon. That's reality. You're not going to change it. Then they say, well, why can't you wait? And I said, look, take off your hat as a scientist. and put on your hat as a consumer of news. You're sitting there 11 o'clock at night, Peter Mansbridge comes on and says, sorry folks, we haven't had time to get the news tonight, but we'll get back. We're working on it and we'll get back to you as soon as we have something. It just isn't going to happen. So what the purpose of these workshops is to teach scientists certain realities of dealing with the media, whether they like it or not. It's a sort of a survival course. And I deal with the various techniques and things that they can do to prepare themselves and to kind of understand what to expect. And again, it's a real eye-opener. Once they've done this little exercise and they don't understand this scientific paper, it's a much chastened group that I'm dealing with after the workshop. I think I've overstayed my welcome here.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It was exactly the exchange of ideas and opinions that I was hoping we'd engender, and I'm sure it was Lydia Dotto's very provocative talk that has stirred up this discussion.